in the mid of the day attended our webinar, our session, our first session for the fall 2020. Really very happy that so many internet people are interested in the topic. Today, Elena Habersky and Amira Sayed-Tebata are going to present the findings from a research project which was conducted by CMRS on refugee entitlement in Egypt. The project is now in our third year, I think. Yes, we had 2 years of research. The first year was more or less law desk research, which was conducted by Claire McNally and predominantly and Amira Hebata. Elena joined the project after 1 year and started the field research doing interviews within the communities just to see, okay, what is the reality of the project and what the law says. Let's compare it. My name is Gerda Heck. Some of you know me already. I'm also assistant professor at the Center for Migration Studies, and together with Dr. Ibrahim Awad, who is the head of the center, I have been a co-principal investigator in this project. Our two presenters today, Amira Hetaba, she holds a Master in Law from the University of Vienna and a Master in International Comparative Law from American University in Cairo. She is in the project since 2018 and has been working as a research officer at the Center for Migration Studies in this project. Elena Habersky, she is currently the project manager of the Refugee Entitlements project. And she has spent the past 7 years working with urban refugee population and conducting research in Amman, Cairo, and Kampala. She holds a Bachelor in International Studies from the University of Scranton and an MA in the Migration and Refugee Studies from the Center for Migration Studies in Cairo. So I don't want to take too much time. What we're going to do is Amira and Elena are going to present findings from the project now. We then have like half an hour time afterwards to have to ask questions. Unfortunately, you are only able to write your questions within the chat. We will read them and answer and get back to you. Okay. Please welcome Elena and Amira.
Thank you, Gerda. Thank you so much, and welcome to our attendees. I know it's the middle of the day for most of us, but I know there are some people who are joining us also from the US, so good morning. I know it's just a little past 8 a.m. over there, so welcome. As Gerda said, my name is Elena Habersky, and I'm the project manager here at the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies on the Refugee Entitlements Project. And on behalf of Amira and myself, we would like to welcome you to this webinar and the interest that we've already seen actually on this topic of refugee entitlement. So we're very excited to present our findings with you and hopefully to answer your questions. So I am going to hopefully share my screen and we will start the presentation. Great. So, as Gerda had mentioned, the Refugee Entitlements in Egypt project is a 3-year project funded by the European Union, and it has 3 main phases. The first phase is desk research, which took about 21 months. So it took a while, and Amira was really in charge of the legal research on this point. She is the key legal researcher at CMRS. And what we did is we looked at international, regional, bilateral, and domestic law with regards to refugee entitlements. So the entitlements that we looked at and we will break down for you are education, housing, employment, healthcare, access to courts, detention and expulsion, and documentation. So we looked at each of these individual entitlements under all of these sections of legal frameworks. And then in the second phase, we had interviews with lawmakers and policymakers, because a lot of the time we either found discrepancies in the law, or we couldn't find a law, or we found something that contradicted maybe from the international to the national domestic framework. So we thought it would be best to ask the policymakers and the lawyers in Cairo our questions, because they're the ones who are working on the ground, working with the refugees, and have day-to-day experience working within the law to help the refugees, asylum seekers, and failed asylum seekers, the three main populations we looked at, hopefully receive their entitlements in Egypt. And then the third phase, or what I consider to be one of the most important phases, is we held focus group discussions with the 9 different refugee communities within Egypt. So Iraqis, Syrians, Sudanese, South Sudanese, Somalis, Eritreans, Ethiopians, Palestinians, and Yemeni. We wanted to also interview the Libyan population, but unfortunately, with the time we were in, we were unable to do so. But we also held interviews with different NGOs, so UN organizations, smaller NGOs like Refuge Egypt, larger INGOs like Plan International, CARE, Save the Children. So we really wanted to get a real holistic approach of what we were looking at, not just looking at the desk research, but also looking and talking to the communities and the people who work with them on a day-to-day basis. So obviously, as I said, limitation was not possible with the Libyans, unfortunately. And Amira can maybe speak more to this, but obviously difficulties in accessing Egyptian legislation. Sometimes the laws weren't there, or they were only in Arabic, or the copy that we had was so old that we could barely read it. So these were the different limitations that we found within this project. And now I'm going to hand it over to Amira, who will talk about the entitlements and start off.
Thank you, Elena, and also welcome to all our participants. I'm very happy you're all here today. So as Elena already introduced the project in general, all the research phases we went through, I'll start off with the report itself, which you will be able to find on the CMRS website. So our report obviously begins typically with an introduction, methodology explained, and some general information about the right to seek asylum and refugee status determination, the RSD, in Egypt. But the main part focuses on 8 different entitlements. So each chapter covers one entitlement. So the rights we covered concern family unity and reunification, employment, education, health, housing, detention, expulsion, access to courts, and documentation. So each chapter is structured the same way. We always start with the legal framework. We analyze in the first step the international legal instruments that could contain specific entitlements. For example, the Refugee Convention, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and all other agreements or treaties that Egypt has ratified, which might contain important provisions for the entitlements we discuss. In a second step, we then look at the regional legal instruments, so any kind of agreements that took place, for example, on a level for the Arab League or the the Organization of African Unity. Then we look at bilateral law, any agreements between Egypt and the second state. And in the last step, we look at the domestic legal framework, which Elena already mentioned is sometimes quite difficult to access and to locate. And during this analysis, we always try to figure out the differences in rights and entitlements for asylum seekers as opposed to refugees, and also failed asylum seekers, whether they're regularly or irregularly in Egypt, what kind of entitlements they can still rely on. And we also put a special focus on differences between different nationalities, because sometimes some nationalities enjoy benefits that others don't. The second part in each chapter always covers the implementation section. Here we describe any gaps that we found between rights that should be there on the international level, but were not implemented in domestic law. Or even if they were implemented, we have used the information we've received from the interviews and the focus group discussions to identify any other problems the communities have when they actually try to access those rights. And based on those identified gaps, we then always give recommendations in each chapter on how to possibly improve the situation. So now Elena and I will give you a short overview over each chapter. Obviously, it has to be very short because the actual report is over 300 pages long, so much more details to be found there. The first chapter deals with the right to family unity and reunification. So under international law, everyone has the right to family unity, which means the family has to be able to stay together and not be separated. and also the right to family reunification. So in case a family was separated, which is very often the case for refugees, they have a right to receive assistance to be reunited again. For refugees and asylum seekers, this right is especially important for three different aspects. Firstly, when it comes to derivative status in the refugee status determination. So usually when one family member receives refugee status, it's possible that close family members also receive derivative refugee status based on this. So in this context, it's always important how family is defined, which family members are entitled to receive this specific status. So there's always a bit of a difficulty in the definition of family, because close family members are always clear, but we're never sure. We have to follow specific evaluations on how to define when a family member is close enough to be actually able to benefit from this right. And the second situation that is commonly faced by refugees are cases of expulsions. If somebody should be expelled from a country, then this should also always only be a measure of last resort, because the state needs to keep family unity in consideration. So you should not separate families. And also the right to request family reunification can often be important if one refugee is already in Egypt, for example, but would like to have his wife or her husband join, or children. So in this context, it would be very important to rely on this right. But unfortunately, in practice, the right to family reunification is very difficult to access because there are no clear procedures on how to actually request it. So it's always depending on basically on the government official you apply to. Sometimes refugees have reported to us that they were successful in having their family members join them in Egypt. Sometimes they weren't. So it's very hard to actually access this right. Yeah. So the next chapter is also a very complex topic, the right to employment. Just to give a very rough overview, the right to employment includes wage earning employment, so the traditional way of being employed by someone, as well as self-employment. So if somebody opens a business, for example. In general, everyone has the right to just and favorable conditions of work, and also the right to access work without discrimination. However, it is possible for states to impose different rules with regard to employment for foreigners in their country. For example, require them to obtain a work permit and fulfill certain conditions first, as long as this differentiation is based on reasonable and objective reasons. So in Egypt, obviously, all foreigners need to obtain a work permit, which is depending on lots of requirements they need to fulfill. But refugees should have special rights under international law. Like according to the Refugee Convention, they are entitled to enjoy the most favorable treatment accorded to nationals of a foreign country. And also any restrictions that are usually imposed on foreigners regarding employment may no longer be applied to refugees if they have resided in the host country for 3 years or have a spouse or children holding the nationality of the host country. Unfortunately, this special exemption is not being applied in Egypt, so they do not receive special treatment after 3 years of being in Egypt. They still are required to obtain a work permit, which is very difficult. It's a costly and complicated process with many legal requirements, and most refugees do not succeed in obtaining a work permit, and they have to rely to engage in informal labor. Anything that's not with an official contract, which obviously makes them vulnerable to exploitation. Self-employment in this context could be an alternative, but it is also very difficult to achieve. So those who actually open a business and start running a business often do this also informally without having the necessary permits. So one of our recommendations in this context was to generally make the access to employment and to open businesses easier for asylum seekers and refugees, to enable them to actually earn a living, because obviously without a salary, without an income, they remain depending on financial aid from service providers, from the government. They cannot take care of themselves on their own like this. And now Elena will cover the next chapter.
Thank you, Amira. So I'm going to be discussing education, something that is obviously very important. And I'm going to break it down between primary education, which is generally elementary education, and secondary and tertiary education, which is more like high school and college. So under international law, everyone has the right to free and compulsory primary education regardless of their nationality or their legal status. So regardless if you are an asylum seeker, if you are a refugee, or even if you are a failed asylum seeker, as a child, you have a right to free and compulsory primary education. Secondary and tertiary education is a bit different. It should be generally available and accessible and without discrimination. However, it does not have to be provided for free, and it can be more expensive than it would be for a national. With regards to the Refugee Convention, which also includes for compulsory and free primary education, Egypt has made a reservation to this and saying that it would determine this on a case-by-case basis. But this goes against other international conventions which require free and compulsory education for all children for primary education. However, when we look at this in practice, the situation on the ground is very different from what is in the legal framework. So there are different bilateral agreements that Egypt has with different countries, for example, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Jordan, where these children can access the public education system. And then there is a decree written in 2018 for Syrian and Yemeni students who can also access the public education system. However, for the other refugee nationalities, particularly the African refugee nationalities, they are not able to access the primary education system for free with the Egyptian public school system. Now, we have been told that this is because for many of them, for example, some South Sudanese, maybe some Eritreans, some Ethiopians, their native language is not Arabic, so they would face difficulties if they were to enter the public school system and to be thrown into an Arabic learning environment. However, it is our hope that all nationalities will be able eventually to access the public school system, regardless of their nationality. However, those that can access the public school system also face difficulties. For example, racial biases against certain nationalities, particularly the Sudanese, makes them less likely to want to enroll their children into the public school system. But even so, for example, the Syrians, who maybe don't say that there is as much racial bias against them, also face issues that an Egyptian child would face in the public school system. There is an issue of overcrowding, which forces a lot of children to just not really go to school. And there's also an issue of teachers being paid very, very low wages. So in order to make up for this and to have a living wage, many teachers will hold outside of classroom tutoring sessions for extra money. So then the students will be almost forced to go to these tutoring sessions and to pay for them so the teacher can make a living wage. But these are, again, problems that are faced both by the refugee populations, but also the Egyptian children as well. What we've seen as an answer to this are community-based schools. So these are schools that are really run by the communities themselves, the administration, our refugees, the teachers are refugees, but these also have some issues. We think they're a pretty good response to the issues of overcrowding and low wages, but they are not recognized by the Ministry of Education, nor are they recognized under Egyptian law. Many of them are maybe in unsafe areas. They're not able to pay for large buildings, so they're located in normal apartment residential buildings. So for example, I went into one last month, the first floor, normal apartments, and then they knock down the walls to make it for administration, and then the second and third floor of the building are for classrooms. However, maybe they don't have a fire escape or a fire exit, which makes them not so much a school and then not recognized by the Egyptian government. So these are some problems that we see in education. It's complicated and it's complex. I mean, for secondary and tertiary, the cost is very prohibitive usually for refugees and asylum seekers. There are certain institutions, including AUC, but also I know some of the public universities who are now offering scholarships for refugees. But these are also difficult sometimes as people flee without paperwork showing that they finished a certain level of education, or they have to take an English class, or a task that may be cost prohibitive. So we're trying to work through this, but it's a very complex entitlement, and really the international law overall is not so much followed with regards to discrimination and free and compulsory primary education for all refugee, asylum seeker, and failed asylum seeker children. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Amira, who's going to discuss health.
Thank you, Elena. So yes, the right to health, of course, is also a very important topic. So the right to health under international law basically means the right for everyone to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So the most important aspect of this right is the right to access medical services without discrimination. Sorry, this is a right that's actually very well implemented on a legal point of view in Egypt. There is a memorandum of understanding between the Ministry of Health and UNHCR that gives all refugees in Egypt access to public primary, secondary, and emergency health care equally with citizens, the same conditions with Egyptians. So this is a very good step that this MOU was signed, and is basically in conformity with Egypt's international obligations. Another aspect other than the access to medical services also covers health insurance. The right to health is also connected to the ability to receive health insurance. In Egypt, technically foreigners can take part in health insurance under the same conditions as nationals once again, but usually health insurance is connected to certain conditions. For example, to being employed, which is, as we have just said, while discussing the chapter on right to employment, it is a difficulty for refugees to receive formal employment, so they cannot get health insurance if they're not formally employed. Other ways of receiving health insurance can be, for example, through children attending school. In the future, Egypt is currently also working on implementing a general health insurance scheme for everyone, which will facilitate health insurance, as it will no longer be tied to specific conditions, but be accessible for everyone in Egypt. And because they also envision to include foreigners and especially even mention refugees in the executive regulation to this law. However, this new health insurance system will be implemented in several steps, and it will take several more years until it's actually in effect in all of Egypt. So it's something to look forward to, but at the moment, unfortunately, nobody can benefit from it yet. So in practice, the refugees and asylum seekers who took part in our focus group discussions have reported that they face a lot of problems when actually trying to access medical care. Despite that they're entitled to receive it, they are sometimes turned away from hospitals because hospitals say they don't have a free bed to treat them. Or sometimes they face discrimination from doctors or hospital staff. And they complained about the low quality services in public hospitals, a lack of cleanliness, that's overcrowded. So in general, to avoid this low quality of government hospitals, they would prefer to use private hospitals, but obviously that is more expensive, and they do not always have the money to actually access private hospitals. In those cases, they are then dependent again to rely on the help of service providers who refer them to the right institution, or maybe directly provide them with medical care or assistance to receive medication. In general, however, if we compare the situation of asylum seekers and refugees to Egyptians in general, we've observed that those are the same problems that are also faced by many Egyptians who need to access the public health sector. So it's not a problem unique to refugees, but more a general issue of a lack of resources in the health sector in Egypt. So our recommendation in this chapter was not to improve some legal framework in Egypt, because the rights are actually there. But this problem can only be solved if the quality of the public health sector in general is improved by more investment into it, which is of course costly and will be difficult to actually implement. And now Elena will continue again.
Thanks, Amira. So our next entitlement is housing. So everyone has a right to an adequate standard of living, including housing. However, as a developing country, Egypt is realizing this progressively. So not all at once, but over a period of time. which is difficult for many refugees and asylum seekers. While basic shelter is a minimum standard, for example, children have more rights under housing than, say, an adult would. They should be near potable water. They should be near health and education facilities. But we rarely see that this is the case. There are issues, for example, with housing, that many refugees and asylum seekers, and even failed asylum seekers who plan to stay in Egypt long term, cannot afford apartments in but neighborhoods that are not informal, so formal neighborhoods. So one issue that we see in Cairo and within Egypt is informal housing being set up by people who maybe are looking for work within Egypt. They come to Cairo, they can't afford an apartment in a formal neighborhood, so they've started setting up informal settlements, and refugees and asylum seekers and failed asylum seekers find this to be more financially feasible, so they also go to these informal neighborhoods. However, problems that are faced are harassment and racial biases and security issues, especially for single women or single mothers with children. They told us in our focus group discussions, they've had people try and break into their apartments before, or they're harassed in the street, or they're scared to open their door for anyone, or they have issues with their landlords. And because they're afraid that if they were to go to the police or to anyone else, they wouldn't receive assistance because they are a refugee and therefore they don't have any rights. This is not really the case, but we found it to be in practice that when refugees and asylum seekers have issues with their landlords, they rarely go to the police, and if they do, they rarely get any assistance. There is an entitlement, for example, that if you are failing to pay rent over many, many months, it is feasible to forcibly evict you, which is also, once again, a problem faced by the refugee and asylum seeking communities. As Amira mentioned, with employment, many of them work in the informal sector. They struggle to find work. Maybe they don't work every day. Maybe it's seasonal. So coming up with rent every month is a huge problem for many. I've been in apartments where almost 20 people are living in one small apartment, and to be able to afford rent and their daily cost of living if they share it. However, it is the right of the landlord to forcibly evict someone, unfortunately, if they consistently fail to pay rent. So really, under this entitlement, it's a difficult entitlement. So we really just want there to be notice for the police that if someone comes to them as a refugee and asylum seeker, they do have rights to deal with their landlords if they have a legal issue. And then detention and expulsion. Obviously, there are special entitlements for refugees and asylum seekers under international law and the Refugee Convention. Even if a refugee or an asylum seeker, is denied refugee status under the refugee status determination, they are also still protected under certain international laws, so they should not be returned to their country of origin if there's a fear of violence or specifically torture. There are special entitlements, again, for certain nationalities. We've seen that arbitrary detention from our focus group discussions is sometimes an issue. Sometimes a refugee or an asylum seeker is stopped on the street by a policeman for whatever reason, and maybe they don't recognize their UNHCR cards. So refugees and asylum seekers in Egypt carry blue and yellow cards from UNHCR stating that they are either seeking asylum or they have refugee status. But sometimes these are not recognized by the police, and they're taken because they're viewed as being in Egypt irregularly. Usually, over time, UNHCR they always try and intervene in these situations, and thankfully, usually these individuals are released. Sometimes they're kept for, unfortunately, a few days or weeks, but usually for arbitrary detention, they're able to get out. We do see some cases of expulsion, but again, thankfully, it's pretty rare that we see it. Again, if you're here irregularly, you don't really have a right to stay in the country, but you should be protected under certain international laws that you should not be returned to your country of origin. Again, if you're going to face persecution, violence, or torture. But again, thankfully, we don't really see that much expulsion happening, that much refoulement. We're hoping, Egypt just changed last year, that refugees and asylum seekers, as well as regular migrants, will receive cards like residency cards. In the past, it was just put on their UNHCR card if they were here regularly or not. But now every migrant in Egypt is receiving a residency card. And we're hoping that with this new system that's in place, these will be more recognized by the police and other institutions that these individuals are here regularly and do have a right to stay within Egypt and to not be detained or expelled. And Amira will go over more in depth if there is a problem, how to access the courts.
Yes, thank you, Elena. So now we come to the last two entitlements that we're discussing on our report. First up, access to courts. So here we try to analyze if it's technically possible for asylum seekers, refugees, and failed asylum seekers to access the legal system in Egypt in case they are involved in any lawsuit, be it criminal or civil law. And in general, we could not locate any provisions excluding foreigners from accessing Egyptian courts. So refugees and asylum seekers have the right to access courts under the same conditions as nationals. International as well as domestic law stipulates a lot of rights and entitlements to ensure fair proceedings, which are applicable to everyone. So this applies to Egyptian nationals as well as foreigners, as well as refugees and asylum seekers. Some examples for these procedural rights are the right to appeal any decision, the right to receive compensation for unlawful detention. The presumption of innocence obviously applies in criminal law cases. And everyone has the right to be given enough time to prepare a defense if accused of a crime, and the right to contact a lawyer. Detained foreigners always also have the right to contact their consular or diplomatic representatives. However, this is very unlikely to benefit refugees. Like asylum seekers or refugees obviously would not like to contact their state representatives for assistance while they're in Egypt seeking asylum. So in practice, as Elena already mentioned when she discussed housing, there are actually a lot of problems when refugees and asylum seekers try to access the legal system because they hesitate to approach the police if they have become victims of a crime or if there are any other kinds of conflicts. They prefer not to press charges. In the focus group discussions, the participants told us that this is due to the fear of being mistreated by the police, or it's based on negative previous experiences which they have heard from family members or friends or have experienced themselves. For example, some of the participants told us that when they actually contacted the police for help, the police officers refused to help them or treated them unfairly and always automatically took the side of the Egyptians. So if it already is so difficult for them to actually access the police to file a lawsuit, obviously they will also struggle to get to the next level of having a case in court. Furthermore, those failed asylum seekers who are in Egypt at the moment without valid residence permits, they are also unable to access courts or contact the police, because if they do, they risk that their illegal status will be identified, and then they risk deportation. So obviously those groups are specifically vulnerable because they will hesitate to approach any official places like the police stations. Our recommendations in this chapter, we had different recommendations, one of them being to maybe establish alternative institution for complaints, which refugees can easier access, and they can receive guidance on how to transmit the complaint later to the police officers later, so that they're not alone facing police officers in the police station. And the last chapter we're discussing in our report is documentation. Documentation deals with a lot of different aspects. So first of all, documentation encompasses the right to have valid identification, to have an ID card. So in Egypt, asylum seekers and refugees are entitled to identity papers clarifying their status. And based on a memorandum of understanding between UNHCR and Egypt, asylum seekers, once they register with UNHCR, receive a yellow card, as Elena already mentioned, and refugees receive the blue card, which serves as a valid identification for them. However, in practice, lots of participants in our focus group discussions have told us that the UNHCR cards are not always accepted by government officials as valid identification because they do not know them, they do not recognize these cards. they require a passport or some other kind of identification they can easier identify. Another aspect of documentation concerns travel documents, having a passport. So refugees are entitled to be issued travel documents according to the Refugee Convention. However, unfortunately in Egypt, refugees are not being issued travel documents. So once their passports have expired and they cannot renew them in their embassies, they're unable to obtain a different kind of travel document. Another very important aspect of documentation concerns residence permits. So when in the first step, an asylum seeker or refugee has received their identity card, obviously they need also a legal status or a legal grounds for being in Egypt. So in order to receive a residence permit, they need to apply for temporary residence. In the law, we actually found that there is a specific provision stating that refugees registered with the United Nations Refugee Office should receive a residence permit for 3 years, which is renewable, which would be a very good entitlement. However, in practice, both asylum seekers and refugees are required to renew their residence permits every 6 months. So this frequent renewal creates a huge administrative effort, both from the side of the applicants, as well as from the government officials responsible for the renewal of permits. So because the renewal takes a lot of time, it's only possible in Cairo. So those refugees who live outside of Cairo have to travel into the city specifically for this process. And it takes a lot of time. So therefore, basically when they receive their new residence permit, a few months later, they already start the process to renew the residence permit, to not risk to be in a limbo in between the renewal without a valid paperwork. So we have observed that many actually decide to not renew the residency simply because this effort becomes too expensive, or it's just too much effort for them to constantly renew the residence permit. So this obviously increases the number of individuals living in Egypt irregularly. Another important aspect of documentation concerns children and their birth certificates. So under international law, every child has the right to be registered after birth and to acquire nationality. Technically, foreigners are able to register the birth of their children at the health office in Egypt under the same requirements as Egyptians. So when we asked the focus group discussion participants about their experience with the birth registration, they told us about a lot of difficulties in practice. So first of all, those who are here without a valid residence permit, which I've just mentioned before, they are unable to register their children because they are too afraid to access the health office or any kind of government institution out of fear of being deported because of their legal status. And also, if your residence permit is in order, there might still be an issue with the paperwork. So, for example, sometimes UNHCR cards are not accepted as valid identification, or the government official requests a birth notification, which cannot be provided because the child was, for example, born outside of a hospital or abroad on the road to Egypt. So there is no official paper from a hospital stating date and place of birth for the child. And often officials also request a marriage certificate, which wrongfully hinders unmarried couples or single mothers or even victims of rape to obtain a birth certificate for their children. So our recommendations in this regard concern in general to raise awareness among government officials and members of the police that UNHCR cards are to be accepted as valid identification for asylum seekers and refugees. Also, obviously, the duration of asylum seekers and refugees' residence permit should be extended beyond a mere 6 months, simply for reasons of efficiency and practicality. Also, it's very important that refugees should be able to obtain a valid travel document so they can freely move across borders. And the requirement of a birth notification when you try to register your child should be lifted in cases of children born abroad or outside of a hospital, and generally just facilitate the issuance of birth certificates for refugees, to not stop the whole process because one piece of paper is missing that the refugee is not able to provide due to their specific situation of being a refugee. Yes, this was all from my side. I think Elena will conclude now.
Yes, thank you, Amira. And thank you all attendees for staying with us through this long presentation, but we hope it was fruitful for all of you. So in our conclusion, some of the things we noticed was that there were large gaps, especially within the legal frameworks. So for example, there's just no domestic legislation in place for the entitlements that are under international law. So we can see this in education, for example. All children, regardless of their nationality or their status, are supposed to receive free and compulsory primary education. Unfortunately, this is not in place within Egypt. Also with education, perhaps, there's a lack of awareness or conflicting legislation as well. So there is a decree for Syrians and Yemenis to enroll their children within the public school system. However, throughout our focus group discussions, we found that parents said they went to go register their child, and the person registering them had no idea that as a Syrian refugee, they were allowed to register their child, and they turned them away and said that they were not allowed to register their children. So there is really, we found a lack of awareness amongst more the, I don't want to say the lower level, but the people really working on the ground and the field workers within the government or different institutions about what the legal framework is. And sometimes it changes so much that it's hard or it's difficult to keep up. And then for domestic legislation, sometimes there's also a lack of resources. Amira mentioned this, especially with regards to health. The law is actually great. There's a memorandum of understanding between the Ministry of Health and UNHCR that all refugees are able to access the public healthcare system. This is great. It's a great entitlement. However, there's a lack of resources in the public hospitals. So we found, as again, Amira mentioned, that when refugees or asylum seekers go to access this entitlement, they're turned away maybe because there's a lack of beds, or there's not enough doctors on staff, or there's just not enough resources to treat them. And sometimes they go to multiple hospitals, and by the 5th hospital, maybe they find what they're looking for, but it takes a while until they're able to access this entitlement. So the way forward, what do we do with this 320-page report with all of these legal analyses and interviews? We started the awareness raising and capacity building phases of our project. Unfortunately, with Corona, it's been set back a little bit because we're not able to do them in person, which is really unfortunate, but we are still doing them online. And we hope to expand the research after this project ends in June, and maybe perhaps look at other entitlements more in depth, because we found that this research really resonated with a lot of people. We hope that maybe other countries can undertake similar research. Hopefully, you know, we've already provided the international legislation, so it might be easier for people to look at their bilateral agreements with other countries and their national and domestic legal frameworks as well. But we really feel that research like this is extremely important, not only for the service providers and for the government, but most especially for the refugees and asylum seekers and failed asylum seekers, of course, who are entitled to these rights. So as of right now, we do have the report available online in English. We are almost done with an Arabic translation of the report for our Arabic speaking populations, which will be very important. And when we do the community events, which will be starting soon, we are hoping to train individuals from different communities who speak local dialects, so then they will be able to then train their communities within their local languages. Again, we want to make this research as accessible as possible to all of the refugee asylum seeking and failed asylum seekers within Cairo and Egypt in general. So this is how we are looking at the last 7 months or less than 7 months of this project. So once again, thank you all for joining us. We hope you learned something and have an interest in going forward with this research. I would like to thank my colleague Amira, who really, I mean, this is her and Claire McNally, our former colleagues, this is their legal research, and they put so much work and effort into this report and into this project. This project would not have been possible without the two of them. and Sarah Abdulhani and Minal Masri and others, and to our dear colleague Aya, who is also in the audience. She is our backbone of community outreach and training, so she will be taking over in the next couple months, and we can't wait for her to work her magic. But for now, I see there's a ton of questions in the chat box. We're excited to get to them, so I'm going to hand over to our PI, Gerda Heck. Thank you once again, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Elena, too.
So, thank you. Thank you, Amira. Thank you, Elena, for this once again very well elaborated, but also very concise and clear presentation on the research findings. Just to make sure how we are going to deal it. It's also possible that you can ask question by voice. You just have to raise your hand and I can give you allowance to talk. But just before, there is a question from Ayman Zori. He typed it in the chat room and he asked, did you communicate the result, the report with the government? And if the answer is yes, what was the government's reaction? Are there any land to conduct and follow up the study in the future? Did you face any problems within the fieldwork? If yes, what were the problems? That is already. Following that, we have then Mohammed Farad and we have Image to Koshi. I don't know, shall we gather the questions? So I think we just start with this bundle of questions by Amazori and then we'll take the other ones.
Okay, so maybe Amira and I can co-answer this, but from what I know, we did interview government officials, so they were aware of the research findings, and we did have someone from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs come to our conference. We had a dissemination conference, thankfully at the end of February, before Corona kind of unfortunately exploded all over the world, but we did have our dissemination report at the end of February. And they did say that they would look at the report and look at the findings, hopefully as they go forward in trying to draft the new asylum law that will be released maybe by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. For those who don't know, Egypt is trying to draft an asylum law. They don't have one currently, so it would be the first for the country. But we're hoping that they use our research findings in at least looking at the entitlements that are owed to these populations.
Yeah, so like if I just add, like Elena said, that like the response we got, at least at the dissemination conference, was quite positive from government officials that were attending. Other than that, like in the next phase, we're also planning on having workshops or trainings with the different stakeholders. One of those stakeholders should also be government official, government institutions. So we will see in this next phase coming up, like in the next few months, we will see how the response is gonna be. We hope it will remain positive, but we can only like share more information on that once we actually manage to hold our workshops and trainings in that regard.
Okay.
What else?
And there was the last question. Did you face any problems in the fieldwork? If yes, what were the problems?
I think for us, the fieldwork, accessing some of the communities was a bit difficult. As I said, the Libyans were a bit hesitant to meet with us. Again, we did contact them at a politically unstable time within Egypt. There were threats of protests, and I think they were concerned about meeting in a group, which we totally understood, and we did not want to push them further into meeting with us. So we unfortunately did not meet with the Libyan population. But one issue I think was COVID happening. We wanted, as Amira said, we did focus group discussions. So we had about 9-10 individuals from each community meeting within groups and discussing, and we thought, wow, this person said something really interesting. I want to know more. I'm more of a one-on-one in-depth ethnographic researcher. So that was my hope. After our dissemination conference, I was going to go back out into the communities and do one-on-one interviews. But unfortunately, COVID kind of halted that. But we tried to do our best. And maybe Amira, as a legal researcher, has other obstacles she faced.
Yeah, no, I think
Okay.
you covered everything with the field work. Thanks.
Okay, we have a lot of questions now. We have 2 hands risen, and then we have questions in the chat. Maybe I just go to Mohammed Fahad, who has raised his hand. Can you talk, Mohammed?
Also, he has questions. In
Yeah,
the chat
I think
box.
I allowed him to talk, so he can talk now.
Mohammed, can you talk? No, you're on mute. I see you're on mute, Mohammed.
You have to unmute yourself.
Maybe the option isn't there for him to unmute.
Well, okay, I tried with the second one.
Okay,
Simon?
so yes, Simon.
Simon, can you talk?
I don't think they have.
Okay, I'm
access.
sorry. I really thought, okay, if not, I will follow now the chat. I'm really sorry. There was Eugenia, and she says, thank you so much for a presentation, very interesting project. I missed the very beginning and apologize if this was mentioned, but could you elaborate a bit further on COVID impact on the entitlement piece? To what extent was it gotten worse? Thank you from Eugenia Butikoya from the Dutch Embassy.
Yes, thank you. So one thing that we did see after COVID was a lot of people being laid off, even in the informal sector. It was very difficult, especially during the lockdown period, for people to find stable work, even if it be informal. So this was one issue that we did see. And then from the employment obviously stems a whole host of issues, being able to pay rent, being able just to buy everyday commodities, having the money to then enroll your children into school for the next school year. So I really think that COVID did it. We saw it more in the beginning. Now I think hopefully we're seeing it level out, since Egypt has not had really a lockdown since, I believe, the end of May, the beginning of June. Thankfully, it didn't hit communities, as far as we can tell, very, very difficult or very harshly. We do know of some refugees who did obviously come down with coronavirus. And unfortunately, I think a few did pass away, but we were bracing for the worst, honestly, with community spread. But from what I can tell, we have not seen that to what we were expecting, which I think for that is really, really good. So Amira, I don't know if you have anything to add. But.
Yeah, no, like it did not affect like the entitlements on a legal level, on a theoretical level. Like there were no new restrictions put on them. It just like, of course, where the situation in practice was already difficult, it worsened the situation for economic reasons, as we have seen with refugees as well as any foreigner living in Egypt or Egyptian nationals, like Elena mentioned, especially with the issue of employment.
Okay. Please, to the participant, please don't raise your hand. Unfortunately, I cannot let you speak. I don't know, it's a problem with the system. Please write your questions in the chat. I'm really sorry about that. There is one question from Gemishu Goshe, and he asked, can refugees and asylum seekers from non-Arabic speakers allowed to enroll their children in Egyptian school, on the one question, and then he has another question, why refugees and asylum seekers paying higher rental prices is now 1,500 to 3,000 Egyptian pound only for refugees. The option is not there to unmute.
Oh, okay, well.
Yeah, the option is not there to unmute. I'm sorry. Yes, I realized this. Sorry
for that. So for refugees and asylum seekers, we have seen some community members from the South Sudanese. And the South Sudanese are interesting because they were originally part of Sudan, obviously. And under some, they've been able to enroll in public schools because they're not really sure, okay, are they still under the agreements we had with Sudan or are they not? Again, some of them do speak Arabic, of course, I understand that, but many do not as well. They're a very diverse linguistic community. But if by nationality they are not allowed to enroll in public schools, then they're not. So the Somalis, the Eritreans, the Ethiopians, these communities are not Iraqis, surprisingly, even though they do speak Arabic, but these are the communities that are not allowed or legally allowed to access the public school system. Again, people are aware And many of these communities do offer Arabic classes, especially to the children. So hopefully one day they will be able to enter the public school system. But right now they're using the language aspect as a reason as to why they are not allowed to enroll into the Egyptian public school system.
So, but for all of these nationalities, it's always like those who are not specifically allowed to access the public schools, they're still able to enroll their children in private schools. Of course, this is a more expensive option, but it's not that they're completely barred from any type of education system. But like maybe what's important to mention here too, that this is not a specific exemption like just for refugees and asylum seekers. Like as Elena mentioned in the education chapter, like there's just a general rule in Egypt according to education laws that foreigners are usually requested to attend private schools except the specific nationalities that Elena mentioned. So this is not some kind of discrimination against refugees and asylum seekers per se, but this is a general framework for based on nationality, but of course still difficult.
Okay. The second part was about the rents.
Rents. So as I had mentioned in housing, many refugees that I speak to try and find the cheapest areas to live in. This is usually informal neighborhoods where they can find the cheaper rents. Of course, there are unfortunately some landlords who try and jack up the rent on refugees because they feel like they can take advantage of them, even though financially many refugees and asylum seekers are not able to pay very high rents. So I think this is why we see a lot of refugee community members live together as a community so they can split the rent cost, but also the cost of food and other household commodities. So I think this is why we see many of the refugee communities live in the neighborhoods that they do, is to try and find the cheapest rent possible.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Mike Yantashka, and he asked, do all refugees face the same status to getting service, or are some communities discriminated against more than others?
Thank you, Mike. Representing Vermont. So yeah, we do see, unfortunately, that the African refugee community sometimes face more obstacles than, say, a Syrian, an Iraqi, or a Yemeni would. This is for racial bias for whatever reason. For example, in the focus group discussions with the Ethiopians, they had mentioned that when they were trying to access the public healthcare system, they were turned away because the doctors refused to treat them because they were stealing Egypt's water. Now, for those who are aware of the GERD dam situation, Ethiopia wants to build a dam on the Nile River, which Egypt is very against. And unfortunately, this political and racial kind of tension is spilling over sometimes into accessing certain entitlements. So we did see that. Again, as Amira mentioned, it's not just refugees, but obviously predominantly African refugee communities have a bigger obstacle in enrolling in the public school system because of their native language, or maybe facing housing issues with the landlord because of racial biases. So we do see, unfortunately, that the African refugee communities face more obstacles than, say, a Syrian, an Iraqi, or a Yemeni would. But Amira might also.
Yeah, no, everything Elena said obviously is correct. And what you could add also is like sometimes there's also a difference in nationality depending on specific aid programs. Like, for example, sometimes some funding that international organizations or service providers receive is earmarked for specific nationalities. So maybe if there is like on an international level, there is a high awareness, for example, of the situation of Syrian refugees, like right after the crisis of in Syria started, there was maybe more funding programs taking place, especially for those nationalities, especially for Syrians, which then of course put other nationalities at a disadvantage because they cannot access it. So it's always also depending on if funding is earmarked for specific nationalities.
Okay. Then there's a comment by Mohammed Farad. Actually, I have a comment on the part of access to court, which was better to be the title, it's access to legal system, as police not included in court system as legal system, more suitable. In addition, does the chapter address the legal aid and refugee access to legal aid? Thanks. I think this was probably more comment and not a question.
Yeah, no, but
Want to respond?
answer on that. Thanks for the comments. Actually, a heading that I would have also considered changing, or would have been a nice title to change it. But when we started writing the project, we had already like written down like the structure, the chapter titles were all there. We just decided to not limit it only on the court system. Like technically access to court should have, like you said, focused mainly on the court system, but because in our research, we realized that actually the problems already start one step below it. Like how do you actually get your case to court if you can file a lawsuit at the report at the police station? So that's why we decided to include these aspects, even though it's technically not courts, but we found that this is very important too, because this is where most of the problems lie. So we hope you find the chapter interesting nevertheless, even if the title is not completely to your liking.
And thank you, Mohammed Farahat, one of our legal experts
Yes.
within Egypt. Thank you.
So, and then there's a comment from Faisal Obama. Thank you guys for organizing this. Refugees are in need of more people like to address the issues. Big love, Elena.
Thank you, my Sudanese Arabic teacher.
And then there's a comment or question from Dahlia Stevens. Congratulations on this excellent study and report. I was only able to join late, so apologize. To what extent do you see Egypt as a model for the region, a rare Arab state party to the convention, and now developing a domestic asylum law? And do you feel the domestic law will make a significant change?
So generally, I think Egypt actually is a very good example for the region. Like when we did our research, like on an international level, as you mentioned, state party to the Refugee Convention, has ratified a huge amount of international treaties concerning human rights and also refugee rights. So obviously, situation is not ideal, as we have put out in the report. There are still many gaps. There's still a lot of room for improvement, but generally speaking, like with our research, like Elena, correct me if you had a different impression, but I think we see Egypt as quite a good example for the region. How it compares to other countries in the region, that would obviously be very interesting to discover further and make comparative studies on this. Unfortunately, we were not able to cover other countries in comparison, but a very good topic that should be further elaborated on. The domestic asylum law, we cannot really say yet what kind of change it will make. It will definitely, hopefully it will be useful, because the main problem we faced during our research is that there is no law specifically addressing refugees and asylum seekers. So this is probably one of the biggest weaknesses in the legal framework, at least from my point of view, because you always have to consider all the laws that apply to foreigners in general, not specifically refugees. So they always fall under this general category of foreigners. So there is no room for special benefits or provisions that take care of their specific situations as asylum seekers and refugees. So with a new law covering asylum law, there is the possibility of improving the situation but obviously only if the provisions are beneficial for refugees. So we can only wait and see what will happen if the law is issued, if it's finally.
Yes, we're all waiting.
Yes. Let's see what's happening. Are you frozen?
Me, no.
Everyone is back? Yes, everyone is back.
Okay.
I think there was a small. Okay, I'm just going on the list. There was again, Himeshu. If I can't enroll my children, how can I integrate within the Egyptian community is the question. What would your answer to that?
This is a really difficult question. It's a great question, but
I mean, you can.
Oh, go ahead.
No, the problem is, like, we see that because of sometimes, like, unfortunately, we have heard from lots of the people we interviewed that there is some kind of hostility sometimes from the Egyptians towards refugee communities, which, as you all know, then results in them living in, like, in areas where all their community members live. Like, for example, Sudanese prefer to stay together in areas where Sudanese live, etc. So obviously, as you said, it's very difficult to integrate with Egyptian community. School would be ideal. So that's why we were like arguing or like we support the idea that refugee and asylum seeker children should be integrated in the public school system if it's possible to integrate them in a way that that they are treated well, that they can actually communicate with Egyptian students, Egyptian children. So that would improve integration and interaction with the Egyptian community. But as this is not working, unfortunately, I don't have any concrete suggestions, unless if you're lucky enough to live in an area, in a neighborhood where you have Egyptian neighbors who are willing to interact. But it always depends on the person. So Elena, do you have any ideas?
No, I was gonna echo you about integrating the students hopefully within the school system in the future. I think this is something most of the organizations, including UNHCR, are working on. It's why they're now offering Arabic classes to students who maybe their native language is not Arabic, in the hopes that in the future they will be able to enroll their children into the school system. But as Amira said, it kind of depends on where you live, who your neighbors are, who you come into daily interaction with, if you have work with Egyptians, a whole host of issues. It's difficult. It's definitely a challenging situation, I think.
Well, thank you. There's like two more comments. One by Riki. Actually, I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you, Elena, and your awesome group from the incredible work that you have been doing for the refugees. It has been a massive impact, and no matter how big or small work for those who are left there looking for the safe places, this kind of work is really making change.
Thank you, Mubarak.
There's another question. Thank you, guys. Your presentation answered all of my questions. Keep it up.
Thank you.
There is also a question from Iman. Thank you for the presentation and research. I understand that it is challenging for refugees to integrate within the Egyptian society. However, from your research, did you witness that refugees have resorted to establishing their own community informal structures, or is this also challenging, given some trust issues among some refugee communities themselves?
This is a really interesting question, and
Yes.
something that I also find interesting in my own research. So we do find, I think we see this most in the community schools, that the communities are establishing their own informal structures. Again, is it everyone within a community? I don't think so. I think it's particular community members within a particular space who are establishing, for example, a community school or a restaurant, or another safe community space, a community-based organization where they have access to a banquet hall or something like this. Of course, there are issues amongst the communities themselves. We see that, for example, sometimes with the Sudanese and different factions of Darfuri refugees who have come over time. But we do see that most communities are very well organized. They do have their own community structures, their own community-based organizations, and from these, they do create schools, restaurants, shops where they import sometimes basic commodities and goods from their countries of origin and sell them. Some of the refugees I know are setting up English classes by themselves because they have a high level of English, so then they teach members from their own community English, so they're trying to assist and help each other. So I really think we do see autonomy of migration within these spaces that are being set up, where these communities make their own decisions, form their own community spaces where they feel safe and insular in a sense.
Okay, thank you. There again, we had two comments. Also, again, thank you very much for your intensive presentation.
Thank you
for a great
Mohammed.
job, Eleanor, Mira. If there's no other question, I think you elaborated a little bit on it. I would like to ask you what you think, how you could further expand this research, or how it could what are your future prospects?
So I think one way in which, I'm interested in education. I believe Amira is as well. And with the different levels of education, we have free and compulsory primary education, but we don't necessarily see those same rights and entitlements for secondary and tertiary education. So I think it'd be really interesting to look at the different levels of the education system, but also these community schools that are really popping up all over Cairo within the different communities, teaching different curriculums from their home countries. What are their enrollment numbers? How do they operate? What are the students learning on a daily or yearly basis? What kind of issues do they face? What kind of trainings, for example, on pedagogy or methodology can the teachers undergo themselves, many of whom are refugees just trying to help their own community without necessarily a background in education. So I think that's one way we could definitely expand. I would also love to do like a cross country, as someone mentions, like, is Egypt a model? I think it'd be really great if we could get some other countries involved in this type of research to kind of see how other countries' entitlements compare and contrast to Egypt's.
Yeah, a country comparison study would definitely be interesting. I think the biggest problem with the research, or not problem, but like a difficulty in this whole project was that it covers so many different aspects, like all these different chapters. So even if we tried our best to analyze each entitlement as much as we could, there would have always been room for like more details, to go further into details, especially the domestic law, or what exactly kind of services can they actually access, much more focus on the practical level, like what kind of support do they receive, what kind of organizations are there they could access. I think the biggest chapter, like Elena said, where we see the biggest potential for more research will be education, because it's really very diverse and in-depth, but obviously also all the other chapters, there would be room for finding out more on each of the entitlements. So a lot more to research on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you once again for this great presentation. Where is again a thank you email? Yes, I think we are at the end of this session of this webinar. I would like to make an announcement from CMRS for those of you who are very interested in this webinar to follow it. On the 23rd of November, at the same time, I think also same place, we have our next webinar, which is on the Venezuelan crisis, understanding the exodus and its humanitarian cost. It's a lecture which is done by Carlos Abanza, who has also a PhD in migration studies. If you're interested in it, please join the webinar again on November 23rd. If you have any other questions, or if you're interested in CMRS, please join Facebook, like us on Facebook, so you will get every information from us. And also on Twitter, yes, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending this, although it was in the middle of a day or in the morning, as in the United States. We are looking forward to see you in our next webinar.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. Bye.
Bye.